My name's Nancia Guivarra. I'm a Murray from Queensland. I'm Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. I've got the best of both worlds. My mum's Aboriginal. She's from Cherbourg. She's a Waka Waka, Bindal Juru and Jungler heritage, so Townsville, Rocky and Cherbourg. And her father, that's my mum's side, her father is Waka Waka. His name's Vince Bunda and he served in World War II. So he's a Anzac. And he was brought up in Cherbourg but moved later on to Perga Mission near Ipswich. But I grew up mostly with my father's side of the family because mum's was a bit fractured in that granddad had another wife, my grandmother, who I never met, my mother's mother, passed on. And so dad's side of the family, the Torres Strait extended family, was really who I grew up with most of my life in Brisbane and Gladstone. Dad's father, Walter Guivarra, is from Ereb, Darnley Island. He's a Pitt. So we're descended from Douglas Pitt, the Jamaican fellow who brought the London Missionary Society and the Coming of the Light. That's on his, my great-great-great-grandfather, and my great-great-great-grandmother is from Murray Island. Her name's Sue Tarbo, and she's from the Muggerum clan, one of the 8 clans of Murray Island. And then that's my granddad. My grandmother is Malay from Thursday Island, and her ancestors were indentured to Thursday Island as pearl divers, and they married into some of the Aboriginal families on Cape York Peninsula, and so we're Wuddafi mob from Shelburne Bay. So that, I always joke that pretty much makes me related to just about every Aboriginal person and Torres Strait Islander person in Queensland, and it's true. I have huge extended family networks as a result of all those origins and where my family are from. I never thought I would ever do anything else or could ever work in a totally non-Indigenous environment or sector because I've just only ever grown up around family. My grandparents, my father's side, my grandmother Nancia and Walter, they set up the Gladstone Aboriginal Housing Cooperative, and even as a child I used to work in that, typing letters on the old manual typewriters, and so I've only ever been around people who've been a part of the community and who've done things for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. In Brisbane and Gladstone, my dad was a musician. Torres Strait Islander side of our family is all Torres Strait Islanders are, in fact, we sing, we dance, and and we play the instruments as well, and that's just natural, I think, because that's dad's side of the family. We're part of the Tropical Troubadours in far north Queensland as well, including my grandmother, and he was in the Opals, the One People of Australia League band, with Darcy Cummins, Marlene's father. He taught my dad to play guitar. He's from Cherbourg, and that's how Mum and Dad met each other in Brisbane. And I was born in that era as well, and did all sorts of things with the activists group of the times that my parents were hanging in, which is the late 60s and early 70s, which, as we know, is the heyday, I suppose, or the modern activist movement. It all began then. I remember as a child modelling for the Opal functions, clothes, those sorts of things. I have loads of memories just growing up around everybody. Angelina Hurley is my cousin, because he was a good friend of my dad's, and her mother is from Cherbourg, and we used to go on family camps, and those networks are really strong. They're a cobweb of relationships that go a long way back. So I do find that really influences who I am, what I do, and as you know, everybody wants to know who you are, where you're from, and who's your mob. I don't necessarily have to do that because Guivarra is a big family in Mapoon and all sorts of different areas, and so I'm easily identified, I think, within my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander identity. Yeah, so definitely, when I have ventured outside the Indigenous sector to work, I've found it really challenging. I worked in the ABC for 10 years, and that was my first journalism job, and at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, our major national broadcaster, and I'd never worked in a non-Indigenous environment before, even though I was working within the Indigenous program. I experienced huge cultural shock and self-confidence eroded really fast because, which I had to build up, and which I did successfully by performing in the job, basically. So I feel like there's an Australian narrative of disadvantage about us, and one that undervalues our capacities and our inherent strengths. And I certainly feel, even though I feel I'm confident in my skills and have accomplished heaps, that you're constantly battling that devaluing of who you are and what your skills base is. And having been through communications and working in broadcast, radio, television, print and online, I'm pretty articulate these days. And I'm told I'm a good talker. Yeah. I'm a single mother. My daughter is 7 years old and her name's Jasmine, and she's amazing. I've certainly gotten to the point now where I'm in this position where I'd have to say I'm a middle-class Australian. But that's a very tenuous position that I don't think a lot of other people understand. I can be middle class today, and at the loss of a job or the change of a climate or a recession, I can suddenly be reduced back to a pension with no accumulated wealth or generations of accumulated wealth to fall back on, like most other generations of Australians and would have. So even though I have a mortgage and a car these days, it just takes the loss of a job, a good job in this climate, which a recession perhaps might do it for loads of our people, and we know that funding has been reduced or removed from lots of different sectors. So I think to see that funding for other people to see us as being privileged in some way is really misguided. Given that funding programs for Indigenous people only started in sort of the early 70s as a result of the referendum and then rolling into the Tent Embassy and the programs of Gough Whitlam, if they're wound back now, the impact hasn't been enough. It takes more than 40 years of funding to overcome 230 years of historical disadvantage and even discrimination. Overt discrimination. So I don't think work's stopped yet. I certainly hope that everything I do contributes to facilitating the future for the generations to come, especially when you have a child. I think that becomes really pertinent to your direction. And me at my age, I'm no longer necessarily career orientated. It's certainly about ensuring that my moral compass and my values are being satisfied, I suppose, through the work that I do, and that I feel like I'm, especially as a broadcaster and a communications person, I'm facilitating those stories for everybody else who may not be able to. And I think that's a really, really important role for us as journalists and broadcasters and communications managers. And these days, lots of us tell stories, but I think in terms of being more direct and hitting the targets, we need more specialists in this area. And we need more specialists in lots of areas. But I know that we've got a lot of lawyers now. We're getting more and more doctors all the time. But unfortunately, because communications isn't an area that really is probably well remunerated like some other professions, and it's not as obvious a need. But I think that it's a great role, and it's a traditional role as a storyteller. We're most definitely facing the same challenges. I've written many a story that has said we want the right to determine our own futures for ourselves and to be given the resources to be able to do that. And that message has never changed. It may take on different applications or different areas where we're applying it to, but we're constantly hearing we need to be consulted. I would take that further, I think, because decisions are being made about us and for us instead of with us or by us. And I would take that even further. I think asking for consultation is not enough. I think we need to be calling for engagement. We need to be calling for healthy relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, Indigenous and people and decision makers in the country. I'm in favour. I don't think that's an easy place to get to. I would be in favour of quotas because I think they make a difference. I think we need to be at the table where the decisions are being made, and if the natural pathways aren't there for us to get there, then we need to create them. And I know that they've worked in, say, New Zealand, and so I certainly support them in Australia, and that is for women and for Indigenous people to be a part of the governing structures of this country. Yeah. I want her to know her family and her history. I don't think that's going to be a problem because it's all around her. They seem to get it by osmosis. Before I even told her what an Aboriginal flag was, she was painting it in kindergarten. And I'm not the sort of parent who wants to turn their child into an activist. That's not how I was taught. I just grew up around what my parents were doing. And she's growing up around what her mum's doing and her uncles and aunts and grandmas. And so she's just learning by osmosis, and I love that. So I have had to make some decisions that can facilitate that and make it easier. So one of them was finding a school that was embracing of Indigenous culture. I had an experience with a public school previously that never acknowledged Indigenous people, and they had a NAIDOC committee, and I volunteered to be a part of it. As we're the only Aboriginal people who were there in the school for the whole year, I thought that would be a likely possibility, but I wasn't asked to join it. So I left that. I took my daughter out of that school, and I've taken her to a school that has full embracement of all sorts of cultures, not just our own. And I think that's what I would like to see Australia become as a nation. I would like to think that it's not an Anglo-Saxon nation, because its halcyon days have been, in its halcyon days, like the gold rush days in the late 1800s, it was a nation that had a lot of different nations and cultures and diversity in it. Unfortunately, that overwhelmed a lot of people, and it quickly turned into the White Australia policy at the turn of the century. But I think, and I see that Australia is changing really fast now, and I'd like to see us, because discrimination's not just about white people and Indigenous people, it's about non-whites. You know, it's about all of the people of colour and difference, and I would like more Australians to embrace all of that. So I've taken her to a school that has more than 50 nations of different cultures and recognises more than loads of religions. I think it's 90 different religions that it celebrates. So I think it's really important, and I've taken to a school in Burwood. That school has laid a plaque. It names its houses after Aboriginal names from the local language, the Wongal Nation, and they've conducted ceremonies, smoking ceremonies to open that. My daughter does the welcomes to country. It's just so beautiful to see, and all of the students at the school, who are from very many diverse nations as well, they celebrate, Rangoli Day, they do Rangolis, and I'm not there. I wish I was there, in fact, and I'd grown up in that sort of environment. So my role as a parent is for my daughter to accept people for people and who they are and their cultures and diversity, and not see difference as something to be fearful of. I've learnt most of my best lessons from older women that I can remember, and that's probably because of the relationship between me and elder women rather than me and elder men. So Arnie Beryl works at the National Centre of Indigenous Excellence with me. She's an amazing woman who is a high achiever, and she says, if you have an education, you have a voice. Because if you don't have an education, if you can't stand up for yourself, if you can't fight your own battles, well, then other people are going to determine your future. if you have an education, if you're articulate, if you can write, if you can read, if you can speak the language of the conquerors, then you can be a part of the discussions of those decision makers, because that's really important, to have those diverse views and perspectives in all of those authoritative bodies. And there's so many of them, from the P&C at your local school to the boards of your local organisations, medical services, anywhere you come into contact with, your local council. It's important for us to be able to partake of all of those things that determine the way that we live and how it's done. So educate yourself would be, I think, the best advice I could give people. Stay true to your values. Know who you are. Tell your children. Know your history. And because your history, you have to know where you're from to know where you're going. We're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been in Australia since for at least 40,000 years, and on this planet for more than 70,000 years, and we're the world's oldest living culture. That already says to me that we're the world's most sustainable people. We're the world's most innovative people as well, because we've been through ice ages and all sorts of things. And seriously, if we've gotten through all of that, then what we're facing now probably has been one of our biggest adversities, in a very concerted way, because we're not facing the environment now, we're facing other human beings. In terms of getting more equality of services, then you should also recognise, I think, that if you're from that ancestry and you're still here today, you obviously come from a mob that has faced all of those incidents through our history and are still here today. So we're all from really great people. And you find that as soon as you talk to an Indigenous person. My great uncle James Rice is part of the Mabo decision. And that's something to be proud of. My great-great-great-grandfather brought the light, and all of these things, you will find the strength in your community. One of the reasons I entered broadcasting in the media was because there is such misrepresentation of Indigenous people in mainstream Australian media that portrays us in negative images constantly, and writing, print and radio, as victims, as incapable, as all sorts of things that that we're not, and it fails to see the positive side of Indigenous Australians and our inherent capacities and our inherent strengths, which are so big, so much bigger than the result of what's happened after 230 years of constant discrimination and historical disadvantage. So it's not the true us. So even though I'm not denying that we face huge adversity, with some social issues. However, our capacities are so much more bigger. That should be recognised. And as a nation like Australia, which has once been, one of the world's most richest nations, and would probably have the capacity to be again if we were open to diversity and if we were open to the contributions of everybody in the nation and ensuring that they had the opportunities to be the best people that they can be as well. So we've made amazing contributions to Australian history in the past, Indigenous Australians, and that is in a Western sense as well, as looking after the country so that it's actually here right now to now. So we have amazing strengths in the sporting field, which I think has been recognised and has provided lots of pathways for many of us to flourish or to bloom. However, we also have very strong inherent capacities in the arts and the cultural industries, in the tourism industries, in the broadcasting industry. It's a huge, strong network that's been in the country since the late... we pirated the first television stations in the 70s in Australia. So that's a really strong sector too that isn't recognised. Our storytelling abilities, our innovation, you need to be innovative to be a part of this world now, and Indigenous Australians wouldn't be here today if we hadn't innovated constantly over the changing conditions in the country that Australia is, and invented things like fire management practices in bush country, and other things in terms of our knowledge our traditional knowledge. It's more than 40,000 years of practice to be able to get to a point where we do it so well. For example, fishing practices. It's very different to the way Western society views it. My dad always tells me that as a Torres Strait Islander, we only eat the little fish because it's the big fish that lay the eggs, and they're tastier too. And the big fish are the ones that are more toxic as well because they've ingested more toxic chemicals. It's the younger ones that are best to eat. That's very different to the Western society view, which says that you can only eat fish over 20 centimetres, I think it is, or 25 centimetres. So, we turn things, after all of these years of experience, they're still coming to learn that we've developed these ways of doing and being in harmony with the country here so that we can keep living, basically. Practices like moiety systems, which ensure that you don't get genetic defects because you can only marry the people who are in the opposite moiety to you in some areas of central and northern and other parts of Australia, I know, and that's not everywhere. But we have astronomy practices. We recognise the stars. We have different seasons. In the top end they have 6 seasons, not 4. There's a whole bunch of knowledge, medicines, intellectual property and capital that I think needs to be valued. I mentioned values before. Our Australian mainstream needs to value our knowledge more, and in some way that can contribute to making a better country for all of us, because Deloitte Access Economics only last year put out a report that said that if every single Indigenous Australian over the age of 18 years were gainfully employed, we'd add a whole lot more $1 billion to this economy. And I'm sure there's lots of other nations who may not be, gainfully engaged within the country as well. So I think it's on that basis that inclusion means a better community for all Australians that we should operate from, and not just for our own communities.